Bennett Zellner and Rochelle Sampson are co-principal investigators of the Connected Leadership Study, which examines the effects of psychedelic experience on decision-making by organizational leaders. They are both associate professors of business and public policy at the Robert H. Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland. Rochelle is also senior research fellow at the ASG Institute at the Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania, and serves on the board of directors of the USONA, I hope I've said that correctly, Institute, a nonprofit conducting clinical trials for psilocybin and 5-MeO-DMT. She holds a PhD from University of Michigan and a law degree from Queensland University of Technology in Australia. And Bennett serves as director or advisor for purpose-centered organizations in the psychedelic field and is a frequent speaker and podcast guest. He holds a PhD from University of California, Berkeley, and a bachelor's from Brown University. So, Rochelle, you're going to start off the presentation, and then Bennett is going to close us out. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Stacy and Mo, for organizing this session today, and for all of you being here in this tricky space, this interesting space, but socially challenging space in some ways. So what I wanted to do was highlight, first of all, kind of my path to being here researching psychedelics. I was not a psychonaut. I am a long-term meditator, sort of like Stacy and Mo, and sort of I kind of came in through that path to sort of this expanded awareness, and am deeply spiritual, though I tend to be very private about that. What I wanted to do was highlight this like sort of intellectual path for coming into this project and the development of the project, since it drives 10,000 questions and answers around research design, right? And partnerships with retreat partners, like how does one kind of build and set out a study like this? So, for almost 20 years, I've been doing research and teaching in the space around what might not be called now regenerative business practice towards systems change. I'm deeply interested in kind of moving the needle on that. We're in the midst, as everybody knows, I don't need to highlight all the seismic shifts that are going on economically, politically, socially, environmentally. And to that end, we need a different way of being in organizations, a different way of making decisions. So I was very interested in like providing the best information to firms on, like how do they identify best practices? How do they think about moving the needle on the environment? Where can they have the greatest impact? How do they create a thriving workforce? Deep relationships with community, really sort of bringing into the fold all the stakeholders in their decision making in a way that leads to all parties thriving. And what I discovered was that this is not an information story. So there were 99 reasons when you talk to leaders as to why they get stuck. This is even among the most well-intentioned leaders, and that's the subject of our study. We look at cohorts of leaders across different organizations, business organizations. And, they, despite the information, despite their intentions, they would point the finger and can't do it because of this, this, and this. And so I began shifting and becoming very interested in like, well, okay, what is it that's getting in the way? And so that informed a lot of my research around kind of these contracting time horizons for leaders, this sort of increasing time pressures, and how that, shortens what they consider, but it also reduces the aperture of the stakeholders that they consider in making decisions in their organizations. And it was like, okay, then, similar to Mo, I read Michael Pollan's book, and became kind of curious, how does one change their mind, in addition to other practices, and, went into the research and thought, well, wait, hey, this is really interesting. I wonder what would happen kind of bringing this into leadership contexts, and would it change how they're making their decisions, right? So that's kind of the research question that motivated me and oriented me in sort of setting out a lot of aspects of the study. And this sort of, let me share my slides now, because this sort of directly leads into, how this study got constructed and like sort of research design decisions. Like I said, the research question drives 10,000 design decisions. I sort of see it as there's kind of two approaches to research in the psychedelic space, right? So you can think of this as like a continuum, right? And there's a little bit of each. On one side, you have psychedelics purely as the phenomenon of interest, right? So you're looking at kind of direct impacts, fundamental clinical or mental health outcomes, physical, like fMRI changes. You could be looking at treatment efficacy, things like that. But even like sort of very direct behavioral, like, a change in belief, religious or political beliefs, things like that. And, that might lead you into some of these kind of specialty venues. And then on the other side is, psychedelics as more of a context for examining a treatment effect. And, I sort of came into it more from that aspect. My outcomes of interest are fundamentally around how do firms make these kinds of leadership or business organization decisions. And so in this sense, then that can lead into some of more of these mainstream venues. And, honestly, there's nothing preferable about either choice. It's just a choice, but it will drive, the research question really kind of drives where you end up. And so, if I were going to position the connected leadership study on the continuum, it's sort of not 100% on the one side, right? But it is sort of leaning more towards that because we're looking very much at these sort of organizational outcomes, this decision-making orientation by leaders and how that affects the professional decisions that they're making in business organizations. So that's kind of like the first sort of forking thing that comes from the research question. And then I wanted to highlight several key structural and design elements that come up in building the study. And then I wanted to highlight sort of two kind of more field lessons, if you will, because we actually have run 3 cohorts at this point, and we've completed year follow-up data collection for all of them. We just completed the last 3rd cohort data collection in November. Now we're in the tedious process of cleaning and getting into the analysis, with hopefully some ready to come this summer. So, but for the design, I think of it as sort of kind of 3 stages, right? So the research question drives everything. What is the outcome that you're interested in? A lot of people here in the room are also academics, or if you're not an academic, you're somebody who's interested in this conjunction with leadership, right? And so, very likely your outcomes of interest relate to that, right? So then it gets into a more difficult pasture, but one that's critically important, which is the identifying of the mechanisms that connect sort of the profound psychedelic experiences that we've all heard about or read about in the research to translational professional behavior, right? It's easy to imagine how it affects your personal relationships. It affects how you show up in the world, how you see yourself, all of those kinds of things. But there is this sort of step by step of identifying. So, we're interested in decision-making orientation. So one has to think about what is it about a mystical experience, for example, or perceptions of awe or perceptions of connectedness that come directly from these experiences that then could shift decision-making for leaders. And that was, for me about, the time horizon, like how it can lead to a reduced threat perception, which allows you to take a wider aperture, a longer time horizon. And there's some psych research as a foundation of this. And then, of course, we looked at our population. You have to decide on your population of interest. For us as leaders, leaders are force multipliers. So, that was an interest given that I'm interested in thinking about, well, what moves the needle on kind of systems change? Does this have any sort of impact around that? Okay. So then, with that, then that leads into, as we all know, like IRB, right? So the design of the protocol in terms of thinking of quant and qualitative. So we have business leaders from wildly different organizational contexts. So they're all business leaders, but, you have partners in law firms, you have, VCs, you have heads of Asia Pacific for commercial products. There are many different types of decisions that they're making, even though they're all leaders, right? So that makes construction of a pure quant measure that's going to capture that for us in this study challenging. So that means the quant measures are really about the orientation the decision-making orientation that I was alluding to, and the qualitative becomes really important about capturing actual outcomes. So that's something to keep in mind, right? So what is the outcome that you're interested? What's the best way of getting at? Timing and duration. Timing, you want a baseline, of course. And then right after retreat is really important to capture the experience before there's a lot of sense making that's happening. And then, say 6 weeks out when the window of neuroplasticity is starting to lessen for participants. And then 4 months, 12 months is how we did it. Duration, we did a year. In the short term, how I think of it is, these experiences can lead to, like, say, imagine a ship at sea, a 1 degree shift in direction. In the short run, that's not a lot of distance difference. In the longer run, you can end up on a different continent, right? And so that's the idea behind having a longer term follow up. It's more expensive, you're balancing that, right? And it takes longer to publication. But in the short run, you don't see the translational stuff as fast, especially to the professional context. It's not happening usually immediately. You have to make a choice about observational or RCT, like a randomized controlled trial. We went observational. RCT, obviously, it's the standard for causality, but the trick with that is that you practically need $1 million grant to do something like that, and FDA approval in the United States. There's a lot of hoops to jump through to get to that. So we opted out for observational, which is cheaper, but we cannot show causality, which means then if you opt for that, the research question has to be interesting on its own, right? It can't just be about the efficacy of the treatment effect because you're not going to be able to demonstrate that definitively. It's going to be about looking at arcs over time, providing, good empirics and descriptives, and so that that can stand on its own. These things all drive the IRB, right? We chose to use an external IRB to the university. We were doing this many years ago, so I can't remember. It was maybe 2021 or something like that that we first applied for our IRB. And the business school at the University of Maryland, the medical school is a different campus. So the IRB has much less ability or much less experience, I should say, with kind of more clinical kinds of ops, even though this was purely observational. And also we had multiple sites planned. So having an external IRB was critical for that. It's also really fast. And then you get a reliance agreement from your home institution if you're doing that. Observational gets you a lot less hot water, but they have to see all the recruitment materials for the retreat center, things like that. Happy to discuss more if there's interest. And then finally, Bennett's going to speak a lot more to this part, the partnerships, sites, and funding. But the observational design can make funding tricky because funders want to fund RCTs. So we were really lucky to have an introduction to someone who ultimately became our founder or funder. And it was a private foundation, and Bennett will talk more about that. So from here, what I want to do is just kind of quickly run through a couple of field insights, if you will, that we gained. There are many. I'm going to talk more. Bennett and I are also in a panel or symposium this summer at the Academy. We'll be talking more about this, and please feel free to buttonhole me at any time. I'm always happy to talk shop. So let me first highlight the first insight of two. So one is that it's like a constant orientation around maintaining research integrity when you're in a commercial setting with many critical stakeholders. And so I put the IRB here as the landscape. And the reason that I view this so critically is it drives consent with your participants, right? So, you are determining, you're telling them what their data is going to be used, how it's going to be used, where it's going to be stored, who's going to have access, what happens with the data at the end of the study. And given that this is a socially sensitive undertaking and you're bringing in business leaders, right? This is not a clinical study, right? They're rightly concerned about, exposure, right? And so you're creating safety for your participants through IRB. And I can't underestimate the value of being under a research study with IRB approval for feelings of legitimacy and safety in going into one of these settings as a leader, right? Not to say that they don't without it. They do. Of course they do. We read about this all the time. But there are many for whom this was a critical aspect of kind of coming into the retreats that we were affiliated with, was the research study. So, so that centers you as the participant. There are just kind of three key partners I want to highlight. One is the commercial retreat partner, and I know Dimitri is one of those here with a strong interest in research, which is a wonderful thing because not all of them are. So, it's an embedded, the research is academic, but it's embedded in a setting where participants are paying significant fees to attend. This is the first kind of friction or misunderstanding to correct in the eyes of participants. They see the study involvement, they think it's going to be free, right? Because there's research. And so that's why you have to keep saying observational. And that means they opt in. So if someone attended Dimitri's retreats, through Evolute, they would have to then opt into a study separately from that. It can't be a requirement, right? And then, of course, with both the commercial retreat partner as well as the coaches and facilitators who are involved working directly with the participants, you need clear data separation. And this is not only for the IRB, but it's also for the participants. Because what you don't want to do is impact how their report is showing up in these experiences. You don't want the observation to influence how they're behaving, what they're allowing to come forth. So we were very clear. We're not collecting data in ceremony. We're not collecting data, we're, observing around so we can describe the treatment, for example. But our data is our data. The retreat center's information and the facilitators, coaches is theirs. And there's a wall. And that really benefits all parties, I think. It preserves the integrity of the research and the privacy of the participants. They get to share what they want to share with the researcher, right? And it also improves the integrity of the treatment, right? Of the actual experience, right? And allows them to be in it. These are very vulnerable spaces. And so one wants to kind of preserve that container. So, so I've spoken about that. Let me just move along to the last insight because I want to give enough time to Bennett. But the key is, it's this dance between kind of maintaining some professional objectivity, if you will, but also preserving warmth and safety for participants in vulnerable settings, right? And the delicacy and profoundness of this work. It takes a lot of courage to step into one of these settings, particularly, if they have, are a leader of a large organization, there's some social sensitivity around that too. It's becoming more accepted, but it's still not mainstream in this community yet, right? Okay, so the last thing I want to say before handing it to Bennett is, I saw this a lot in the interviews I was doing. Okay, so one needs to hold this boundary between the lived experience of the participants and making causal inference. Okay, so let me explain what I mean by that. So when you're talking with your participants, first of all, these are leaders. They're very cerebral. They're smart. They're good at showing causality. They're good at narratives, right? This is, what they do, right? It's a big part of their jobs and why they've been successful. So what they're going to do is they're going to create their own narrative in the data. And they're going to want to tell you what's causal or not. You might just be asking an open-ended question about, what did you notice? What are the key decisions you're making now? Is that the same or different for you? And they'll say, well, it's different, but I don't know if it's because of this. It's like, well, you just have to say, don't worry. Well, we're very careful about causality, but you want them to share with you what their experience is without putting too much post hoc interpretation on it. So but it's also their experience, right, through their lens. So there's this subjectivity, objectivity dance. And then, of course, we as researchers have to think, okay, well, what can we actually argue? And, you're trying to preserve this sort of analytic distance here, which isn't easy to do. I mean, ideally, what would happen is we get like some kind of 360 of sorts, but that requires a whole other level of kind of consent and awareness of entering into these kinds of things. And that might be possible in some areas. Some have talked about doing it in teams. That raises different issues around consent because what you don't want is any pressure to enter into one of these experiences because everybody on the team is doing it. These are deep experiences. You're really stepping into massaging neuroplasticity, and they can have very challenging experiences. So one wants to do so voluntarily. And it's really important to kind of maintain that going into this. So, all that said, there are about a million other things I could say. But the last thing I'll close with is what's interesting is, even though these are very accomplished people in our cohorts, they want to provide good data. They want to be good research participants. And, I keep having to tell them, it doesn't matter if nothing happened. It doesn't matter if you tell me something bad happened or good happened. This is all data, and so I have to kind of constantly reiterate that with participants so that they will do that. So just keep that, they're still human, right? In that way. So with that, I know Bennett has a lot to say about this study as well, and also his kind of perspective on how he came into it. So with that, let me stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Bennett.
Thanks. Well, thanks everyone for being here. It's wonderful to meet you all virtually. So yeah, as Rochelle had suggested, I will talk a little bit about my path into this study, and then I'll spend a few minutes talking about cultivating retreat partnerships, recruiting participants, securing funding, and ultimately, how do we translate this type of work into practice? So the short version of how I got here is, I'm trained as a business economist. I teach at the University of Maryland. I spent the first part of my career doing relatively traditional business school research, and I felt very disconnected from my work. And I had my own set of experiences with expanded states about 15 years ago now that helped surface why this was. And what came to me is that I was studying a deeply dysfunctional economic system from within it. And in some ways, my work was helping to perpetuate that system. So this opened up to me regenerative economics, which focuses on how we might apply the patterns and principles of living systems to socioeconomic structures. And at its core, regenerative economics is really about relationality. It's about the recognition that healthy systems are built on reciprocal relationships. And this is an idea that ended up shaping not only my research interests, but also how we also ultimately ended up approaching this study. And I'll share more about that momentarily. My sort of break, if you will, came in 2018 when I met a woman named Tura Patterson, who's the Senior Director of Strategic Partnerships at USONA Institute, which was already mentioned. It's a nonprofit organization conducting clinical trials for psilocybin and 5-MeO. Tura invited me to speak at USONA's annual conference, the International Forum on Consciousness, which I recommend to all of you. It's actually coming up at the end of May. It's a fabulous conference. And I found there a ready appetite for regenerative business approaches within the psychedelic field. So after that initial talk, I started speaking at lots of other conferences, meeting lots of people and organizations in the field, and just becoming more deeply embedded. But at this point, of course, this was still pre-pandemic or the beginning of the pandemic. There were no clinics yet. I don't know if you heard the news this morning. I think we're a big step closer to that now, but we can talk about that later. And I wanted to have an impact outside the psychedelic field itself. And so I was thinking, where could I have the most impact as a business school professor? What sorts of research could I participate in that would broaden my impact beyond the psychedelic field itself? And Rochelle and I had been in conversation about these topics on and off for some time. We'd known each other since grad school. And we had dinner one night with Tura from USONA. And it was over that dinner that the idea for this connected leadership study crystallized. Now, subsequent to that, the study I think I'm speaking for myself, but think this was true for Rochelle too. It felt intuitively like such the right thing to do. But as we had many subsequent conversations about it, we realized what a heavy lift it would be to get FDA and IRB approval if we wanted to try to do an RCT. I don't even think you really can do an RCT in this kind of research, but even if we just wanted to do a well person study, that seemed like it was going to be a challenge. And right around this time, two pieces fell into place. One was that I was put into contact with someone who had been doing observational research on ayahuasca studies in Peru. And Rochelle and I started talking about this and realized that an observational setup might be a great way to go about doing this research. Because if we're observers, we're observing. We're not actually facilitating anything that might be considered illegal or would need FCA permission or anything like that. The other thing that happened is I was on the advisory board of an organization called Synthesis, which was pretty much the gold standard retreat organization at the time. They were running psilocybin retreats in the Netherlands. And because I was close with their CEO and I knew she had a very deep interest in running a leadership program, although they had yet to start one. So one thing led to another, and they decided to launch a leadership program and engage us as the observational research partner. Then the pandemic happened, and we finally got our IRB approval, and they scheduled the first leadership retreat in 2022. Now, the reason Synthesis worked so well, as I said, is that they were the gold standard organization in the space. They were in a legal jurisdiction, the Netherlands. They had a professional multidisciplinary facilitation team, lots of experience in high-dose psilocybin work, and it also had, in addition to people coming from more of a wisdom tradition, psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists, and they were also willingness to work within a research protocol. So this setting, this kind of approach, this multidisciplinary approach, and this reputation was really helpful for a study involving executives, because these are people, as Rochelle said, with a lot to lose professionally if something went wrong here. So our pilot cohort with them went great. They did an amazing job. We couldn't wait to work with them more, and then they went bankrupt. And we had to find a new retreat partner. And we did a very long search, again, because it's so important for participant perception, among other things. And we found another one in the Netherlands called Kiumi. And they came through trusted sources and they ran a great retreat, but it turned out they had a much weaker business infrastructure than Synthesis. And this created this created some additional challenges for us, because we had to kind of step in, still working within the bounds of what the IRB would allow us to, but we had to step in and become more involved in raising awareness in the hope that people would actually sign up for this retreat and ultimately for our research. So I'd be happy to share war stories about that, but just in the interest of time, I think I'll keep on moving. So in terms of recruiting participants, they have to, these are people, because they have so much at stake, they need to trust not just the retreat experience, but also the research itself, that their data will be handled carefully, that their identities will be protected. And there's an additional responsibility for us as researchers in this context, because even though the retreat and the research were technically separate, the research legitimized the retreat for many of the people in this audience that we were focusing on, and that's what led them to consider it in the first place. So ultimately, as I said, we spent a lot of time trying to raise awareness and recruit people within the confines of the IRB for the Kiumi retreat. A lot of it came down to having warm relationships. A lot of this comes down to trust. It's not stuff that can be done overnight. And most of the people who signed up were people that had, we weren't necessarily people we knew directly, but had, 2 or 3 degrees of separation from us. Okay, in terms of funding, I know my time is running short. I'll just say that there's no standard pathway for this kind of research. We needed philanthropic funding from organizations who understood both the psychedelic space and the value of rigorous research. And the way we got the funding was, once again, as with the participants, relational. Our primary funder is a foundation that we were introduced to through a mutual contact. We spent over a year building the relationship with them. They don't have an open application process. They eventually invited us to apply, and that's how we got the research side funded. But a crucial element of our design, which made it much, much more complicated in many ways, is that because it's an observational research study, the participants have to pay their own way. When people hear research, they often think, oh, that means I'm getting paid for. So that created one kind of source of tension. And then, of course, these things aren't cheap. So then this just added a whole additional kind of set of challenges around trying to attract people to participate in the program and in the study. So let me just close now, because I think my time's probably up. So I just want to talk about translation. So the core question of the connected leadership study isn't just do psychedelics change leaders, it's does inner transformation translate into organizational decision making? There's a gap between personal transformation and systemic change. And plenty of people have profound psychedelic experiences, and then they go back to business as usual. So this study is designed in some ways to fill that gap, to figure out what makes the difference between a powerful personal experience and an actual shift in how someone leads. And I think this matters beyond the specific academic contribution because much leadership development research focuses on skills, behaviors, and competencies. We're asking a different question. What happens when you shift the underlying orientation? And Rochelle talked about this too, how someone sees themselves in relation to their organization, their stakeholders, and their impact. And that's a question with implications not just for leadership development programs, but I would argue for how we think about organizational change more broadly. So this translational question, how do we take what we're learning? This translational question of how do we take what we're learning and build it into something that can reach more leaders is really essential for us. And the challenge is building the research infrastructure to study that question rigorously. And ultimately, it connects back to where I started. The question of whether inner transformation can drive systemic change is a question about whether we can build more regenerative organizations and institutions. And I think the study is one of the most direct ways that has come to me to study this question. So just kind of my final point, if I didn't emphasize this enough, I think there's one through line that runs through everything that I've described today, and it's that this kind of research is fundamentally relational. The psychedelic field operates in a community logic: trust, reputation, shared commitment, reciprocity. And in part, it's because decades of stigmatization have made it that way. So every element of building this study, finding retreat partners, recruiting participants, securing funding, depend on relationships that were built not over weeks or months, but that were literally built over years. Understanding how transformation works in organizational leaders requires getting close to the phenomenon. And getting close requires a relational orientation that, frankly, is what regenerative systems are built on. So with that, I'm probably a minute or two over time, for which I apologize. I will turn the floor back. Thank you.